is Ananya Avilipsa, and I welcome you all to today's distinguished lecture series organized by Pondicherry University. First of all, I would request our Honorable Vice Chancellor, Professor Gurmeet Singh, Dean, School of Humanities, Professor Clement S. Lutz, Registrar Sir, and Director, Professor Tarini Karasu, and our esteemed distinguished speaker, Professor Vibha Singh Chauhan, onto the stage, please, sir. Now, I would like to request Professor Clement S. Lutz, Dean, School of Humanities, to please deliver the welcome address. Please give him a big round of applause.
Esteemed Vice Chancellor, Director of Studies, Registrar, our special guest of today, Professor Vibha Singh Chauhan, Professor T. Marks, Head of the Department. I am very happy to welcome you all. Usually, the department make arrangements for these type of lectures, and the Vice Chancellor will be invited. But we have a Vice Chancellor with a difference. He usually organizes some programs, and he will be inviting us to participate. And naturally, this is something very great. Let us all give a big hand to him. And I think that this is the 7th or 8th program of that kind. Whenever there is a distinguished speaker, whenever he comes to know of a distinguished personality, he would immediately ask me, why don't you make use of him? And perhaps I may not be knowing that particular person, but he will give all the particulars needed. The only thing I have to arrange for a meeting, and this is something uncommon that you find in the academic scenario. So I welcome you, sir, and also for bringing in such a distinguished speaker. Professor Vibha Singh Chauhan is well versed in English literature, education, and law. Her area of interests include gender studies, culture studies, non-urban livelihoods, and protest movements. I happened to watch some of her programs in the YouTube, and I marveled at the way in which she speaks, so that even an ordinary person, a layman who may not be knowing much about the subject, can understand it. Diluting the language to the maximum possible extent is a mark of scholarship. And in that way, I think that we will be all benefited by her talk. And listening to a person for some time is as good as reading 100 books, they say. So probably after listening to her, you would say that we had the satisfaction of having read not 100 books but 1,000 books. She has also authored many books and articles in reputed journals, and she is the recipient of several prestigious awards. And I don't want to go into detail, perhaps because of her humility she may not like it, but she is a scholar, every inch a scholar, that I understood when I started listening to her. Then I would be failing in my duty if I did not say anything about our head of the department, a very dynamic person, our HOD, and I always used to call him T. Marks as talented Marks. But this time I am going to remove that name and simply call him MM, Man of Miracles. Because I gave him a very short notice only yesterday to arrange for this. Now you see the entire hall is crowded and there is no place to sit. The students are sitting on the floor, that too after writing their end semester examination in the morning. I know that you have a very hectic schedule, but in spite of that, you are all gathered here, speaks volumes about your interest in listening to our madam, the distinguished speaker. So I wholeheartedly congratulate you and also welcome you all for this August gathering where you are going to be benefited much by her talk. Thank you so much.
Now I would humbly request our Vice Chancellor, Sir, Professor Gurmeet Singh, to give out today's presidential address. Please, sir.
Well, good afternoon, friends. Let me begin with an apology. This talk was to start at 2:30 and we are 1 hour late. This was beyond our control because there were too many events today. There was a meeting of Hindi committee and a couple of other programs. And after that, obviously we had to go in for a quick lunch, which we did, and we rushed here. I was told in the morning, sir, there are too many programs you have scheduled within these 2 days. Won't it be very difficult? I said, when we have more programs like this, we say the more the merrier. We say that because this speaks about the vibrancy of the academic atmosphere that we have now in our university, and which goes a long way for the betterment of our students, young minds. The moment you attend a talk like this, you embark on a journey which will give you a direction, what area to work on. So I am very delighted that when Professor Chauhan, who happens to be my old teacher and is a very vibrant person, you talk to anybody in academic circles, they will know him. And I was taught by him way back in 1971. You know, he's a Rhodes Scholar, let me tell you very quickly, and he's a long distance runner. And he will, apart from that, he's into many things. So many, probably he will himself find it difficult to remember. So many awards and all kinds of. The thing that I would like to point out here is the benefit, rich benefit that we all in teaching community are reaping out of our good salaries and good resources that we have. That 7th pay commission which we were given, it was his work single-handedly. People opposed that this much is not to be done, but he stuck to his words that he said, no, this has to be given to our university teachers. So we owe a great sense of gratitude to him. So when I requested, he agreed, and his wife, Professor Vibha Singh Chauhan here, who is giving a talk now, she headed one of the finest colleges of University of Delhi, which is called Kirori College. It is known in academic circles as one of the finest academic institutions. And most of the good actors that you find in the Bollywood, they come from Kirori College. They have such a rich theatre in their college that the person, the committee which selects people, whatever kind of pressure you may exert, unless a person is meeting certain requirements, the person will not be in. That is the hallmark, and that is the result of that wonderful thing that many people have gone into Bollywood and they have made a big name. The recent one was one whom we lost recently, Satish Kaushik, that great comedian. So she is heading that college. This college has excelled in theatre, in sports, in academics. They have a good debating society, and some of the great debaters have been from that. And if those who are from the political science background here, if you have heard the name of one gentleman called Professor Frank Thakurdas, such a legendary teacher that when he would give lecture, people will come from far flung areas to listen to his talks. And after listening to his talks, people in this subject has gone in towards all walks of life. They have been wonderful academic administrators, sports persons, and all. Such a great motivator he was. So she is heading that college. And recently when NAC team visited, this college got the highest ranking in the university, which is a feather in our cap. So when this program was finalized, we requested her also to accompany and give a talk in our English department because that's her essential discipline. So I welcome Mrs. Vibha Chauhan here for this talk, and I wish all of you a very happy interaction here with this speaker, and all the very best. Thank you very much, please.
I would now request all the dignitaries to join the audience, for it is now time to commence today's lecture series on the topic Myth, Protest and Marginalization, an Approach to the Novel Society in India. I am sure it will be highly informative for all of us. So without further ado, I request Professor Vibha Singh Chauhan to come up on the dais and start off today's lecture.
Honorable Vice Chancellor Professor Singh. He is, we share the university from which he came here, and we are indeed very happy to visit the university, and I'm grateful that you have found time to come here. I know you have had a very, very hectic morning, but thank you very much for inviting me and being here. Thank you, sir, the PVC sir, for being here. Mr. Registrars of the university, thank you for being here. Many thanks to Head of Department and Dean English Department at Pondicherry University, all the faculty members and dear students. I'm indeed happy to be here. I think the last that I addressed students was last year in December. And after seeing you, I realized what I was missing. And it's good to be with young students. And I am indeed happy to be here. The topic that I have selected for today, Myth, Protest and Marginalization, an approach to the novel and society in India, is something about which a lot has been written and talked of, sometimes directly and sometimes indirectly. And what it actually involves or includes is a perennial issue of the relationship between literature and society. What is it? How does literature get constructed? What impacts what? Is it literature that impacts society, society that impacts literature? How does it get constructed? And so these are issues that actually we have been grappling with. Whenever we read a text, whenever we analyze this text, and whenever we critically comment on text. I'm not going to go into definitions of text. They are wide enough and complex enough, and they need a separate forum for discussion. But I do have noted down some points, more in the form of propositions, and then some examples, and I do hope it opens up at least a little bit of discussion after my presentation. So I start my presentation with a reference to Foucault's book, The Order of Discourse. It's a 1981 book which discusses how various structures of power exercise the function of selection and rejection in the process of constituting norms, processes, and systems. These together constitute what we call the order of discourse. It's a conceptual space where discourse gets constructed and disseminated, sometimes quite obviously in overt ways and sometimes in covert ways. In its simplest form, what is a discourse? In its simplest form, discourse may be understood as a set of meaningful statements on any given area, topic, or theme. Theoretically, these meaningful statements can be infinite. Well, we can make any statement, anywhere, anytime, in any system, circumstance. Theoretically, yes. But we are not able to do so. Why does it happen? Because there exist many factors and deep-seated structures within any given discourse that restrain and limit the inclusion of several patterns of thoughts, production of knowledge, and action in the discourse. The intellectual, perceptual, or affective concepts that fall outside this order of discourse find it difficult, if not impossible, to enter it due to several factors. There is something called mainstream discourse. Not everything is acceptable, cannot enter that discourse and find legitimacy. The three major methods through which inclusion of so-called unacceptable, undesirable concepts are controlled are by testing these on the anvil of taboo, institutional ratification, and the distinction between madness and sanity. There are taboos. What are taboos? What is institutional ratification? Only something which has institutional ratification will be able to enter the mainstream discourse. So who makes these? These are Foucault's thoughts on discourse, disruption of discourse, and creation of new discourses. If discourse means meaningful statements, then mad persons cannot construct a discourse, and statements considered to be insane are naturally kept outside the discourse. In other words, to think outside the settled discourse is defined as madness. And this is, of course, controlled by what are considered taboos and institutional ratification by the particular society where one is a member. In any society, there are always prohibitions surrounding certain topics, and so there is an absence of discourse on certain topics in those specific societies. Some are not allowed, some ideas, topics, concerns are not allowed to enter the mainstream. Prohibitive and taboo subjects may vary from time to time and from society to society, but there will be always some taboos around which discourse formation becomes very difficult. Institutional ratification means close control of the discourse by regulating the circulation of statements and by prioritizing and foregrounding certain statements while marginalizing or even gagging certain other opposing statements. If the social situation is underlined by a power imbalance, then it is the institution of the more powerful that controls knowledge and its discursive manifestations. The kinds of discourse prevalent in any situation is dependent on institutions that regulate and ratify the production and dissemination of knowledge. These are institutions that are associated with the powerful. So that is the relationship between power and any other kind of discourse that falls outside the existing main powerful discourse. There is thus a close interrelationship between the idea of power and that of discourse that is reinforced by institutional ratification. It is the discourse of the powerful that gets circulated as truth and true knowledge. This also includes the process of meaning making that is limited and controlled by deep-seated regulations. The second quote that I would like to read out is from Foucault's History of Madness, where he makes the comment, and this is his quote, "Modern man no longer communicates with the modern madman. Modern man is the one who is very well settled in the mainstream discourse, and the madman lies outside it." He says, these days, which is he's talking about his times, which is early 1960s, the modern man no longer communicates with the madman. The constitution of madness as mental illness bears witness to a rupture in a dialogue. The rupturing of dialogue that Foucault mentions actually repeats the fact of madness as something that is constituted. if the discourse is constituted, then what is inside sane and what is outside also is constituted. And it is also suggested that one could indeed carry on dialogue across barriers that are assumed to be impenetrable, and that seemingly paradoxical constructs are actually much more porous than is generally assumed. Can there be a dialogue between somebody who is constituted and institutionally ratified within the mainstream discourse and somebody outside it? He says there is a possibility. But we generally close down those possibilities because that is, and what regulates that? The powers that constitute the mainstream discourse. This erasure of watertight experiences has the potential of reorienting theoretical agendas and expanding the space for the grey and the opaque, along with building connections between obvious and the concealed, mind and matter, accepted and not fully accepted. These watertight compartments which these silos of discourses create, he says that actually these compartments are also cemented by the institutional ratification. We find the above taxonomies functioning in the process of defining and locating both the social text as well as creativity. This happens within creative writing as well as outside it, which means in lived experience as well as in creative texts. These categories are functional and active. This becomes pertinent since there does exist a correlation between the acceptance and either or rejection of specific social groups as well as their creative endeavors within a settled and accepted discourses in society. What I am talking of is canonization. Acceptance of something as being standardized, good, and something as not being so. In literary texts as well as in society. Who are or which are the groups which fall outside the mainstream in literary texts as well as in social communities? And one issue, I told you I'll give you a few examples, is that of nomenclature. For example, I'm sure you're familiar with the term of new literatures. The issue of so-called new literatures may be discussed as a case in point. So what is new literature? What is new literature? What new would be something which had not existed earlier, comes into existence to latest, closest to us. New literatures, popularly actually the term was used for indigenous writing. I am a little hesitant to use the word tribal, but the government uses it, tribal ministry and so on, and I'm sure all of you are aware that tribal is a contested term. So, but still I'll use it here for the sake of just focusing and clarity. It deals with basically tribal literature and what we widely call Dalit literature. But why should they be called new literatures and basically tribal literature? They have existed since ancient times, the groups as well as their literature. So this term new literature I'm using as an example how it becomes contested. These had challenged once the indigenous literature is accepted, raises its head. What do? They challenge the conventional canon of what is deemed to be literature.
carry on.
Yeah, yeah. What was deemed to be literature and where, and they were once condemned to the silence zone, very much like the groups of people who create these. That's the connection between social discourse and literary discourse. Writings by Dalits and indigenous people, for instance, began to achieve prominence and visibility in literary traditions only after these groups themselves acquired some amount of political and social power in society. Orality, in several cases, was then pulled out of the sphere of folklore and relocated in the realm of folk literature and then in the overall realm of literature. There is a whole discourse of oral and written literature, and there is a hierarchy that still exists. But that is being challenged at least. And when does it begin? If you look at the history of the literature, if you look at the history of indigenous writing, even if it is in India, you will find that it is when these groups start challenging the existing socio-political power structures, that is when their creative expression also starts entering the realm of what is widely called and known as literature. At present, the case is that several critics argue the case for a superior distinctiveness of these literatures. There are several actually well-known critics who say it's not just literature, it is a literature superior to written literature. Several critics have rejected the very nomenclature of new literature on the ground that it is necessary to assert that the literature of the Adivasis and other indigenous groups is not a new movement, nor is it a fresh trend in the field of literature. The truth is that most people have simply been unaware of its existence, and that is not the fault of the indigenous. It's more the ignorance of ratifying institutions than the other way around, that these literatures were silenced. What is new and is still in the process? In process is the attempt to see imaginative expression in indigenous languages not merely as folklore but as literature. A very convenient way is to construct subsidiary discourses. Okay, this is not literature. And you see, these are categories. What I'm talking of is an approach which could probably be applied to different so-called groups of literary writing, and discussion could be opened up. Regional writer, regional novelist. Well, regional novelist, why should the novelist be called regional? A novelist is a novelist is a novelist. And literature is folklore. Convenient to make this sub-discourse of folklore and keep it out of the mainstream literary discourse. And what these critics are saying is that something called folklore is exactly this. Therefore, do away with this criteria, just call it literature. It's much more ancient literature than written literature is. To hear indigenous speech not as a dialect but as a language. Again, actually literature is extremely, sometimes it can be explosive. You know, a lot of people who don't read literature, they wonder why books are banned, and those who write literature also wonder why books are banned. And if literature is so much to do with the imaginary, the unreal and so on, it should not pose any danger to. But obviously, even those who don't read those books think of literature as something more potent than merely some pointless words on paper. And therefore, you see, it becomes important for writing to be slotted in the way that is most convenient to critically powerful discourses. The same is true about dialect and language. Again, dialect, very contested word. Language, very contested word. So what is a dialect? If one speaks of Hindi, now popularly it is said, well, Awadhi is a dialect of Hindi. Well, Awadhi is a much older language. It does have a grammar. It does have even written text, forget about oral text. Hindi was constructed much after Awadhi's existence. It was first Hindavi, etc., etc. So how can it be a dialect of Hindi? It historically kind of goes, everything goes upside down. So I would not really like to go into these details, but these are the issues that make us aware and conscious of how a language is termed, or why a language is termed a dialect, and a dialect is not called a language. And all these are languages. What is it that composes language, and what is it that composes dialect? Dialect, like folklore, a category to keep it out of language. This attitude may be somewhat unconventional if we start looking at oral as literature. It's no longer very unconventional, but it is still a challenge. But this will look unconventional only until we recall that scripts themselves are relatively new, and that the printing of literary texts goes no further back than a few centuries, in comparison with creative experiments with the human ability to produce speech and creativity through speech. A lot of ancient literature in India, north and south, was oral. So is it not literature? Do we then say, how do we define it? So this is the issue of definition, processes, systems, location. Where in this whole network of balance of power will you locate these? It is logical to raise queries about what are the features of a given social or literary text that determine the marginality of specific groups of people or narratives. Again, what is it that is marginalized? What is mainstream? A set of propositions have also been suggested by the historian Ranjit Guha. You may have heard his name. Actually, literature is also again a discipline which includes, it's almost all inclusive of history, political science, psychology, sciences. I mean, it partakes of everything because it is a study of human society, human expression, human creativity, power, etc. So the one way, actually a slightly different way, but saying the same thing, is Ranjit Guha, who in many of his books and articles discusses and talks of what he calls, and this is in quotation, the small voices of history. He's talking of historiography. What is it? What is history? Like, what is literature? What is history? Small voices of history. And in this article, he discusses the concepts of what is historic, marginalized, hegemonic, dominant. And he says that actually there is some discrimination, some unspecified values and unstated criteria which are used to decide what is to be considered as dominant or mainstream, as well as what is its opposite, the marginalized. What are the loud voices and what are not so loud voices? He goes on to suggest, and he's a historian, so he talks of the state more directly. He says that the nominating authority, another term for ratifying institutions, who ratifies, yes, this is literature, this is not, yes, this is the right, correct thing, and this is not. So he says the nominating authority that determines all this is none other than an ideology of the state. And it is this that decides what is history, what is hegemony, what is mainstream, what is marginalized. It is this ideology, and he calls it statism. He calls it statism, and it is this which he says is what authorizes the dominant values of the state to determine the criteria of the mainstream. This acquires a place of its own through its availability and appeal to the reading public. What becomes acceptable is, and then there is a reproduction and circulation of that concept. And he says that it becomes available to the reading public, progeny of the printing technology, and avid consumers. We, people like us, are who consume this and reinforce that concept of the mainstream. And these products are catered to all the readership. He also says that small voices which are drowned, voices which are small are drowned in these strong statist commands. And that is why we don't hear them. They don't get reproduced, they don't get published, and we don't, and the whole system, the statism, it silences them, and so for us also, they get silenced. That is why it is up to us to make the extra effort to develop the special skill and above all, cultivate the disposition to hear these voices and interact with them, because these soft and small voices have many stories to tell, stories which may not have been told till we hear them. Stories which for their complexities are unequaled by status discourse, the variety, the variation. You see, in the mainstream discourse, there is a kind of homogenization which will not exist in these smaller voices, which are distinct. And immediately, I'm talking of voices and literary expression, but we can immediately associate them with these smaller communities, which exist with their own cultures, languages, myths, marginalizations, and everything else. So Guha is also trying to carve out a new canon and claims an exalted status for the small voices as being more harmonious than the noise of the status command, which we know. Sometimes when we pick the newspaper and read the headline, you know what the item would be describing. It may not be true about if you read about specific communities. There is much, much more variation. It is these small voices and the people with these small voices that are excluded from the wider institutionally ratified socio-literary canals of discourse. It used to be the colonial discourse, it can be contemporary discourse. But these are markers, some of the dominant markers of post-colonial societies and literatures, and the major axis around which the discourse of tradition and modernity is structured. What is modernity? What is tradition? And there are other social scientists like Partha Chatterjee, who says that he talks about what modernity is, Sudipto Kaviraj, modernity is constituted of individualism is a strong marker. But he says even the most modern individual or groups or societies in post-colonial societies like India are not freed from community moorings, which has a subterranean existence. And he talks of various things from caste to gender to myth, which we carry within us, with modern individuals we carry these within ourselves. The small voices and the small communities and the use of myth in life and literature is often identified as an indication of their difference from corridors of modernity and status discourse. It would be worthwhile to look at myth creation as a form of community articulation. And what is myth? Sometimes myth is taken as a synonym for falsehood. But that's the simplest kind of meaning one connects with myth. Because myth is also studied and read as an entry point into the true condition, social condition, tradition of different communities. Lots of times if you read the myths of different communities, you find that they actually articulate the degradation, deprivation, as well as an attempt to make sense of it. Why is this community so degraded? Myths have a very common, they talk of common early times when the community had great respect and then there was some wrongdoing and result of it, that is this degradation. So that tries sometimes to rationalize this degradation, but certainly provides an entry point for us to understand and try and interpret what kind of degradation it is living through. Often myth holds the memory of glorious past that may infuse some illusion of self-esteem in communities that are devoid of it. Narratives of origins as well as of creation of community gods bind the community and its members to a common history, which is usually history of community to which it is very specific and it is not shared by a wider society. Again, many definitions of what community means. And one is, of course, it's a geographically contiguous group of people sharing a common history and geography. And if that is true, then they share the natural resources also. And the myths actually grow out of these. They are ancient, they keep getting transposed, they keep getting transformed. And that's how myths can assist us in understanding the socio-creative and the power structure within the community itself also. Now, the way the British historians like W. Hunter or Buchanan looked at some of these local myths and what is called the local village gods, actually this is something which happens all through India. If one travels, one of course gets very huge big temples of the mainstream gods and goddesses. But one sees small shapeless stones sometimes under a tree outside a village with vermilion and some signs of it being worshipped. And when you go into the history of when this came into existence, what is the story behind it, you would get story of some repression. And amazingly, most of them are actually results of some kind of an unnatural death. And this is an unnatural death happens due to certain social conditions. And to set the balance of ethics and morality correct, perhaps this is one way of restoring some kind of order in society, or there are different ways of looking at it, but certainly it tells us of some kind of unsettling, breaking of a balance within that society. Strangely, most of these actually involve women. The unnatural deaths of women, early death. A woman who was close to being raped jumps in the lake and dies. and there would be a little memorial there, and she's turned into a local goddess. So you can say this is all stories rotating around, and perhaps there is truth, or perhaps there is no truth. Nobody is making a claim for that. But these are ways in which societies balance themselves. And what are these narratives? Are these narrative stories? Are they human documents? Are they human stories? Or are these just some kind of shapeless, what Buchanan and Hunter called, some stories of the vulgar? And by vulgar they meant, of course, vulgar in the old English term, meaning the common masses. But it's also a term of condemnation. So if one looks at colonial historiography, that's the way they would look at it, because that was their discourse of colonized and the colonial. If we are looking at it today, we certainly would have a different perspective, because we have read, and there are lots of studies. I have actually references, I don't want to really go into those details, of studies by Saurabh Dubey. He's talking of the Devi movement in Gujarat, and how there is an incident in a village and the concept of the Devi, and there are huge processions and stories circulating. Where will you locate these stories? In which discourse will you locate these stories? Are these creative expressions? Is this lived reality? Where do they merge? How do we understand who they represent? In which language they are articulated? Are these myths? Are these truths? Or are truths myths mythical, or is mythical the truth? So you see, it's a complex overlaying, palimpsest of all these ideas that I do wish to draw your attention to. Let me now talk of, and these deities, the local deities that I mentioned to you, this is not something which is specific only to India. You find it in Kenya, in Ghana, in Rwanda, and you find the stories connected with it. Again, communities, where communities are in existence, you would have these myths and these stories. Let me just talk of, I just mentioned gender, caste, and these are the different discourses where some ideas, themes, concepts are located, sometimes for convenience and sometimes for transformation. And I want to mention one book and one incident from that book to show how an idea, a symbol that is construed or understood as symbolizing repression, as symbolizes lack of respectability, gets transformed and springs into the realm of creation of power. And I'm going to mention one book in Hindi. I'm sure many of you or most of you may not have heard of this book. It's a book by a contemporary writer called Maitreyi Pushpa, and the name of the book is Alma Kabutri. The central character is a woman called Alma. She belongs to the community of Kabutras. You've heard of the DNTs, the criminal tribes, the denotified tribes. There's very strong literature now available actually in different languages. I'm not talking of only Hindi and English. They are writing in their local community language as well. So Alma is a young girl from this community Kabutra that is considered to be a criminal community. Anybody knows who were the criminal tribes or criminal communities? Well, they were considered these communities were considered to be criminal communities, and this nomenclature was given by the British. And a child born in this community was considered to be a criminal since the time of birth. It was branded as criminal. Any lawlessness, theft happened, these members from criminal community were arrested. It was only in 1954 that they were so-called denotified. So they were called DNTs, denotified tribal communities. Alma belongs to this community. And they are all considered robbers, thieves, etc., etc., etc. But her father educates her in the hope of a better life. But she belongs to the Kabutra community. She is abducted. She is abducted not once, more than once. Finally, she is brought to the state capital, gets trapped amongst these political goons as such. However, she draws the attention of one minister, a man who is illiterate, but he is a minister. He gets attracted to her because of her literacy, because he is not able to cope with what he is supposed to work on. And she begins to work for him, she marries him. He is shot dead. But before this happens, you see, when she is abducted and so on, just to kind of repress her further, her abductors get her name tattooed on her wrist, Alma Kabutri. And so, this is what your status is. Remember that. Anybody who sees this will remember you are a Kabutri. You're untrustworthy. So she has this taboo on her hand. After she gets married, the minister is shot dead and so on. And she rises up as his political heir. She gets the ticket and she wins it on one ground, that tattoo. She showed off her tattoo. And she says, I am yours and you are mine. And the communities vote for her. So something that was seen as a sign of weakness is used by Alma for strength. And this is the transformation actually that happens in her life. So what happens? She herself gets institutional ratification, and she herself then gets transformed into an instrument that would provide ratification to others. And therefore, you see, it is this that also shifts the formation of dominant discourses. Yet, the limitation on the discourse creation of disempowered groups and silencing their already small voices continues. Alma is one Alma Kabutri, maybe a small group of Alma Kabutris. But this silencing continues in various forms and as inseparable part of social process in any society where differentiation between social groups creates a wide network of hierarchies. So on the one hand, discourses keep falling down, new discourses keep coming up, but then they get empowered, assimilation of power here and the repression. So, and hierarchies are constructed, again, ratification. The remedy, therefore, I am using the word remedy, but I should not be using it. I should be saying that we can look at it. What do we do about it? Something is there in collective striving for transforming the mainstream discourses, in that the status ratification come into the picture in a very big way, and only a serious and purposeful discourse on marginalization can contribute to the construction of an alternative and anti-marginalization ideology and discourse. Thank you very much.
According to you, do you think it is important for these stories to be recorded and passed on in the form of culture, or should it be as a folklore, because in the coming generations might not learn about it, because we have some stories in there are some stories in Odisha which are written in the form of songs and sung, but what according to you does these stories have importance?
I think your statement actually has your answer within it, because if it's there in Orissa, it's in Maharashtra, it is in UP, I'm sure parts of this. So, in some sense, it is an expression of the emotional, social, ethical life of that community. And when do they disappear? They will disappear if this life of the community undergoes transformation. They also will get transformed or maybe disappear. Some of them have disappeared. So I think your question is whether they should be recorded. They should be recorded as, they are rich sources of history and literature. And they are unconscious. They are not controlled by status commands. They are unconscious and therefore more authentic. And more authentic way of learning about that community. So I think it is extremely important for these to be recorded and for these to be treated as a very rich source for literary as well as historical as well as social texts. I do feel so. I think they provide, actually there is, some of us have worked in a small area, and this could be, I'm not saying you have to do it, but this could be an extremely good project. We come from our richnesses, in India, we take the fact of knowing 2 or 3 languages very naturally. All of us know at least 2 languages, and maybe 3, maybe 4, but at least 2. We are connected to these different social networks, and if we could just gather some of these, what is the oral material, I think we would be really putting together a big treasure for everybody. If you could do it, you are young people from different places, just explore a little, just look at what he said, the myths. You will find, and you can learn the way of understanding literature and that society through that.
To conclude today's lecture series, I would like to request HOD, Department of English, Professor T. Marks, to come upon the dais and deliver the vote of thanks.
Friends, very good evening to you all. I am bestowed with the responsibility of proposing the vote of thanks on this wonderful occasion. First and foremost, my profound thanks are to Professor Vibha Chauhan for having accepted our invitation and for having delivered a very insightful lecture on myth, protest and marginalization. Ma'am, it was such an amazing lecture, and it was so very well organized with the thesis statement and with a lot of facts substantiated with examples. And you started very beautifully with Foucault, and you took us to Ranajit Guha, and you established whatever you wanted to establish through your presentation. I'm reminded of the romantic cry, heard melodies are sweet, but those unheard are sweeter. And if I am to sum up your speech in a crux, I would say heard tales are powerful, but those unheard are more powerful. And heard tales become histories, and those unheard become historiographies. And very beautifully, with the tool of new historicism, you have tried to unravel the power of myths and how myths become part of an articulate part of communities, be it minority communities or majoritarian communities, and ultimately you nailed the politics of canonization very, very brilliantly. Thank you so much for that very resourceful, insightful lecture. I would also like to extend my thanks to our esteemed Vice Chancellor, sir, for having brought this resourceful guest of honor to our campus, to our department especially. Whenever we organize a program, automatically he extends all kinds of support, and he always comes out with his wishes for the department. You all know him as a professor of chemistry, but we, the faculty of English department, know him also as a reader of literature. We have to be a little bit careful when we speak certain things related to literature with our Honorable Vice Chancellor, because he often, unexpectedly, he'll ask questions from William Shakespeare, Charles Dickens, Jane Austen, and many others. What you all read today in your post-graduation, he had read in his school days as small novels and plays. So he's partly a literature person. So on behalf of our department, sir, I make an earnest appeal to you to spare some time of your hectic schedule and deliver a lecture on science and literature for our students. I would like to thank Professor Chauhan, the teacher of our mentor, and Professor Malhotra for being with us this evening. I also thank our Dean, School of Humanities, Professor Clementus Luth, for his ever-inspiring kind of a motivating kind of person he is always, and whenever we approach him with any kind of appeal, he fulfills all kinds of things, and we have no obstacles in executing all our activities, departmental literary activities. Thank you so much, Clement sir, for your love and concern for the department. I thank my colleagues, Dr. Binu Zakaria, Dr. Vishaka Devi, for your presence. I thank Professor Nalini Thambi, Professor Padma Priya, and all other my colleagues from the Silver Jubilee campus. Last but not the least, I extend my hearty thanks to all my students and scholar friends for being part of this wonderful event. And it's like a speaker without audience is like a painter without a brush. So it's you who made this event so very successful. Thank you so much, and love you all. Thank you so much.
Good evening. So a lot has been said about all of us, and on behalf of us three, that's Vibha Chauhan, Dr. Chauhan, and myself, I would request our VC and a good friend Gurmeet sir to accept a small token of love from us in front of all of you. Please.